Let's start today by telling you what I was doing before I was LDS. I wasn't heading towards the gospel, that's for sure. Instead, I was going backwards through religious history, through mythology, archaeology, and ancient texts. I wasn't looking for any church, I just wanted to know what human beings believed about God before anyone had an institution to protect, before any council had convened to define what was orthodox, and before anyone had a political reason to simplify the picture. The further back I went, the same basic structure kept showing up. A supreme God, a council of divine beings beneath him, and a heavenly assembly that deliberated, governed, and had some kind of relationship with humanity. The names changed depending on the culture, the language changed, and the geography changed. But the underlying architecture was consistent across Sumer, Egypt, Canaan, India, Greece, Mesoamerica, the Norse world, and the oldest strata of the Hebrew Bible itself. And that's just the short list. But the one thing that I genuinely could not locate at the origin point of any ancient major tradition was strict philosophical monotheism. The idea of a single, solitary, immaterial divine substance with no council, no divine family, and no plurality of any kind. That conception showed up later, and always traceable to a specific philosophical or political moment, never at the origin of a tradition. In Christianity, that exact moment is precisely datable. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, convened by an emperor, not a bishop, and using Greek philosophical vocabulary that doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible. We'll come back to that, but what matters for you to know going in is that the framework I found everywhere in the oldest record is not the framework that most people were taught as being both obvious and ancient. Now, before we get into it, as always, let's talk about the sources. The scholars that I'm drawing on today are primarily still non-LDS. A large number are non-Christian, and some of them are just secular. Michael Heiser, who built the most comprehensive modern case for the Divine Council in the Hebrew Bible, was a Protestant evangelical endorsed by Dallas Theological Seminary, not an LDS seminary if you were curious. Frank Moore Cross, who documented how the Old Testament was editorially shaped in the 7th century BC, was a Harvard professor of Hebrew and ancient languages. Margaret Barker, who spent her career reconstructing what Israelite religion looked like before that reshaping happened, is a British Methodist. And Mark S. Smith, who traced how Israelite theology evolved from an explicitly henotheistic context, is at Princeton Theological Seminary. The reason I'm telling you this up front is that the argument that I'm going to make today, and on every episode, doesn't require you to trust LDS sources, but it does require you to engage with what the Academy's own scholarship established. If you want to dismiss the following video, then you need to give a reason to dismiss Heiser and Cross and Barker and Smith and the Ugaritic comparative linguistics record and the Deuteronomistic history thesis, just to name a few. That's a much heavier lift than most critics are willing to make. Now, we've been to Deuteronomy 32 before, you all know the verse, and we've covered Josiah's reform, Barker's first temple theology, and why the timing of the brass plates leaving Jerusalem matters. Today, that's the foundation of the argument. So, if you haven't been watching up to this point, I at least encourage you to go back and watch some of those videos yourself. Just one last thing before we get going. As always, thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel. I do hope to have a crowdfunding option set up for those of you that have reached out and shown interest. I will also be setting up an Amazon wishlist for anyone that feels prompted to send books my way. And I'll also keep everyone updated, but upgrades to my entire production are in the works. It'll probably be an all-at-once kind of thing. So, like I said, as always, thank you to everyone for the continued support, and feel free to reach out with questions at my email that's listed in the channel description. But today's video, we're going to be asking a serious question that critics try to avoid. How do you know what the Old Testament originally said about God? I'm not asking what your translation says, not what your pastor taught you, and definitely not what the Council of Nicaea decided in 325. But what did the original Hebrew text teach about the nature of God and the structure of heaven? That's where we start. All of my sources are in the pinned comment below. Verify everything yourself. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard. So let's start with the basics. Doesn't the Bible clearly teach that there is only one God, and isn't that like the whole foundation of Judaism and Christianity? The most common starting point for that argument is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. It's really there, it's central to Jewish faith, and it's not going anywhere. But the Hebrew word translated as one there is Echad, which refers to a unified composite. It's the same word that Genesis uses in chapter 2 when a man and a woman become one flesh. It is not the word for absolute numerical singularity, which would actually be Yachid. If the authors had wanted to say that God is alone in the universe with no other divine beings, that word does exist, but they chose not to use it. The point is this: the Shema has never been, in the original Hebrew, a flat assertion that no other divine beings exist. It's an assertion of covenantal loyalty. It's a statement saying, this is the God that Israel belongs to. That's a deeply meaningful theological statement for millions of people today, but it is definitively a different statement than only one divine being exists in the cosmos. Once you can understand that distinction, you start running into texts that the strict monotheism framework has a hard time reconciling. And not because they're ambiguous, but because they describe beings who are explicitly called divine, explicitly subordinate to Yahweh, and explicitly operating in a structured relationship with Him. The Shema doesn't forbid any of those beings, and the rest of the Hebrew Bible actively describes them. Psalm 82, Job 1, Isaiah 6, and Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 are just some examples. These are among the most studied texts in the Old Testament, and what they describe, read straightforwardly in the original Hebrew, is a populated heaven, a God who presides, a council that operates, and divine beings with real roles and positions and genuine agency. Heiser spent an entire career arguing exactly all of this from the primary text, and he called it the divine council. He was making an argument for what the Hebrew Bible actually says, not for the LDS Church. So let's look at exactly where the divine council is in the Bible. We'll walk through just some of the actual texts. Psalm 82 is probably the clearest example, so let's look at how the standard alternative reading doesn't really hold up. The Psalms opens with God, Elohim, standing in the divine assembly. The Hebrew phrase is Adat El, the council of El, and he renders judgment against the other Elohim, the other divine beings, for their failure to administer justice on earth. Verse 6 says, I said you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. And then in verse 7, nevertheless, like men you shall die, and fall like any prince. The most common modern reading says that these are just human judges being called gods, metaphorically, and the psalm is just warning them about mortality. But think about what that would actually require. God is supposedly addressing a group of human judges, calling them gods and sons of the Most High, and then the threat he issues is that they will die like men. So, like the men that they already are? That framing can only carry rhetorical force if the beings being addressed would not ordinarily die like men. You can't threaten a human being with human mortality as though it's a consequence that they would want to avoid. The comparison requires a baseline that, at the very least, isn't human. It's also worth noting that Jesus quotes this psalm directly in John chapter 10, verse 34 and 35, when his opponents accuse him of blasphemy for calling himself the Son of God. His response is to point at Psalm 82. Is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming? Jesus is using it as a live legal argument in his own defense. He's not explaining the psalm away or treating it as a figure of speech, and that only works if the beings in Psalm 82 are actually divine. Otherwise, the analogy has no force. But I guess Jesus apparently didn't get the memo that it was just poetic language about judges. But Psalm 82 is just one example. 1 Kings 22 tells of the prophet Micaiah describing a vision of the divine council, watching Yahweh deliberate with the heavenly host about what to do with King Ahab, not as a monologue, but as a governing body in session, with members offering competing proposals before a decision is finally reached. And then Isaiah 6 has Isaiah transported into the throne room, hearing God ask, whom shall I send? But if God is a solitary being, then the question has no audience and makes no sense as a council deliberation. The plural deliberative context is what gives the question its meaning. Zechariah 3 depicts Joshua the high priest standing before the divine council with the accuser opposing him. A prosecutorial proceeding in a divine court with a presiding figure, an accuser, and a defendant, which is clearly not a conversation between two beings, but a council structure. Job 1 and 2 have the sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh's throne on a scheduled basis, which is the kind of language of a subordinate body reporting to a superior. And Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 has God saying, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Now, the ancient Hebrew doesn't use a royal plural the way medieval European monarchs did, and so the most natural reading of that grammatical construction inside the cosmological world that the ancient Near East was operating in is a divine council deliberating over the creation of humanity. The same kind of construction also appears in texts like the Babylonian creation epic, Enuma Elish, where the divine assembly addresses humanity's creation the same way, with "let us create mankind" type of language. None of these texts are isolated verses being pressed into service. They all share a coherent cosmological framework in which God presides over a structured divine assembly, and that framework runs from Genesis through the prophets consistently enough that Heiser called it the single most important interpretive key to understanding the Hebrew Bible. So naturally, if the divine council is so present in the text, why doesn't it feature prominently in most Christian teaching? The straightforward answer is simply that the text was edited. We talk about this all the time on the channel, but it was done deliberately by people with a specific theological program and the institutional authority to implement it. Now, before anyone reaches for the word conspiracy, just hear this. Biblical editing is what the academic field has established over the course of the 20th century. It's the standard curriculum at Harvard Divinity, Princeton Theological Seminary, Oxford, Notre Dame, and the Jewish Theological Seminary. And even if you reject the academic framework entirely and work only from the biblical text itself, you still have to account for 2 Kings chapter 22, where the book of the law is conveniently discovered in the temple during Josiah's reign and just happens to perfectly support everything that Josiah's reform wanted to do anyway. You don't need a theory about editors to notice that a document found at exactly the right moment by exactly the right people contains exactly the right content. The debate in the scholarly literature isn't whether the editing happened. The debate is simply about the extent of the editing and the precise mechanisms of how. Frank Moore Cross at Harvard spent decades documenting what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history, the editorial shaping of the books from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, into a coherent theological narrative. Martin Noth first proposed the basic framework in 1943, and Cross refined it significantly. The argument is that this section of the Hebrew Bible was compiled and edited by scribes working during and after the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BC, with a specific program in mind: to centralize worship in Jerusalem, to eliminate the regional high places, enforce a strict Yahweh-only monotheism, and suppress or destroy whatever complicated that picture. References to other divine beings, divine council theology, and the worship of a divine feminine figure alongside Yahweh were progressively suppressed, reinterpreted, or removed entirely. The feminine figure is also not a scholarly invention. She's actually still named in the text 40 times. Her name is Asherah, and she appears in the Hebrew Bible almost exclusively in condemnation by reformers, which is itself actually evidence of how widespread her veneration was. Archaeologists in 1975 discovered inscriptions at Kuntalit Arjud in the Sinai dating to approximately 800 BC that read Yahweh and his Asherah, treating her as Yahweh's consort. So, we know that the reform removed her because the inscriptions still remember what the text was edited to forget. Then, of course, we have Margaret Barker, the British Methodist scholar and former president of the Society for Old Testament Study. She has spent her career working on what she calls First Temple theology, which is the religious framework that existed in Israel before the Deuteronomistic reform changed it. Her argument is that what Josiah's scribes removed was the complex divine hierarchy, what Barker identifies as the distinct figure of the Son of God as a second divine being, and the anointing theology associated with the temple. And here's where the Book of Mormon comes in. Lehi's family left Jerusalem around 600 BC, approximately 20 years after Josiah's reform was implemented. 20 years might sound like enough time for reform to take hold completely, but the historical and the textual evidence suggests otherwise. Josiah's reform was geographically uneven. It was enforced with greatest intensity in Jerusalem and the immediate surrounding region, while the outlying priestly communities and scribal traditions preserved older materials with considerably less disruption. Barker specifically argues that the priestly tradition Lehi was operating within, like a tradition connected to the older Zadokite priesthood and First Temple theology, was exactly the kind of community that would have maintained pre-Reformed texts and theological frameworks. The brass plates they carried represent not the official Deuteronomistically shaped text that the Jerusalem establishment was producing, but more so the scriptural tradition as it existed in that older priestly stream before the reshaping was complete. So that's the basic explanatory framework for why the Book of Mormon's theology looks the way that it does. It was carried out of Jerusalem with a thread of tradition that the Reformers hadn't fully suppressed yet, from a priestly community that had a reason to preserve what the others were removing. As for why most pastors don't typically teach Psalm 82 as a divine counsel text, by the time the interpretive tradition had done its work, the cosmological category that would make sense of the psalm had already been flattened into something manageable. Things like, those are human judges, those are fallen angels, and that's just poetic language. But each of those readings imports a later theological category into a text that predates it by centuries. The text, when read on its own terms, says something that the later tradition found genuinely inconvenient, so the later tradition found other ways to read it. Which brings up another natural question. If the divine counsel is this embedded in the Hebrew Bible and this thoroughly suppressed in the tradition that followed, is this a uniquely Israelite phenomenon, or is it something broader? Because the answer matters for what we conclude about Joseph Smith. Well, it shows up everywhere, and I mean that literally. We'll start with the Sumerians. This is the oldest literate civilization that we have written records from. They had the Anunnaki, a divine council of great gods, presiding over human fate, with On at the head and a ranked assembly beneath him deliberating over cosmic decisions. The Akkadians and Babylonians inherited that same basic structure, with the Igigi and the Anunnaki as two tiers of divine beings, a supreme god presiding, and with fates and decisions decreed in council. Their creation epic, the Enuma Elish, has the divine assembly addressing the creation of humanity in the plural, let us create mankind. The same plural deliberation structure as Genesis, but thousands of miles removed and hundreds of years apart. Then we have the Canaanites, Israel's immediate neighbors, who had El presiding over a council of 70 divine sons, the Bene El, with Baal functioning as a subordinate divine figure. We know this from the Ugaritic tablets discovered in 1929 at Ras Shamra in modern Syria, which is written in a language close enough to Hebrew that scholars regularly use them as a reference dictionary for the Old Testament. The Egyptians had the Ennead, 9 divine beings at Heliopolis governing creation, and separately the Ogdoad at Hermopolis, 8 primordial deities representing the forces before creation. The Hittites had a divine council called the Panku, a full assembly of gods with deliberative authority. The Assyrians structured their pantheon around a divine assembly with Asherah at the head. Now, the Persians under early Zoroastrianism had Ahura Mazda as the supreme wise lord, but the persistent opposition of Angra Mainyu as near-equal cosmic force introduces a dualism that complicates any clean monotheistic reading. The Greeks had Zeus presiding over the Olympian Council, with 12 gods maintaining distinct domains, genuine agency, and genuine relationships. And then the Romans inherited that structure through Jupiter. The Norse had Odin presiding over the Aesir in Asgard's council halls, deliberating over the fate of the world. And the Vedic tradition in India had Indra presiding over the Devas, 33 major divine beings in a cosmic hierarchy, each governing specific domains of reality. Then we have the Aztecs, pardon these pronunciations, but they had Ometeotl presiding over a divine council, including Quetzalcoatl, Tezcatlipoca, and Tlaloc. The Maya's Popol Vuh describes a divine council deliberating in explicit plural language over the creation of humanity. The Chinese had the Jade Emperor presiding over a full celestial bureaucracy, including councils, ministries, and ranked divine officials governing the cosmos. Japanese Shinto has a populated divine realm of kami, which are distinct beings governing different domains of existence. and Aboriginal Australian traditions, isolated from all of the above for tens of thousands of years, describe the dream time as populated with multiple creator beings who deliberate and act together. Every one of these traditions, independently and across every inhabited continent, with no meaningful contact between most of them, arrived at the same basic cosmological structure: a supreme being with a council of divine persons beneath him, and a populated heaven, full of divine beings with actual agency and relationships. And all of these traditions, just to name a few. Now, the next move for critics is to try to short circuit what I'm about to say next by saying, so what, ancient paganism had a lot of gods. Are you guys pagan? But there's so much wrong with that, so I'll just explain what the convergence actually means and why it matters. It's not that these 17 traditions having similar cosmologies is just a fun fact. It's that independent convergence on the same complex framework across completely unconnected civilizations requires a coherent explanation, and the available options are pretty limited. So, option 1, they all independently invented the same complex structure through simple coincidence. But this fails tremendously at the level of structural specificity, because the convergence isn't a bunch of vague similarities, it's structural precision, like a tiered hierarchy, a deliberative function, and a supreme being in a defined relationship with subordinate divine persons who hold named roles across domains of creation. Random coincidence doesn't ever produce that degree of overlap across 17 independent traditions, let alone all the traditions that I didn't mention. Now, option 2, there's some kind of universal psychological impulse toward this specific framework, but this fails for the exact same reason. Psychological universals produce more variation in the details, not less. If anything should be universal, it's the simplest possible conception of God, and that's definitely not what the ancient world produced. And option 3 is that they were all preserving in their own vocabularies and understanding the fragments of something that they had in common at an earlier point. That's the entire framework that the LDS central thesis operates on. One original revelation that was fragmented globally and preserved in pieces across every major civilization. Now, the specific LDS application of that thesis is not required for the logic to work, and I'm not asking anyone to accept that thesis on the basis of this argument alone. But what this argument does is establish something narrower and also more defensible. If the ancient world independently and consistently converged on a cosmological architecture that matches what Joseph Smith described, then the claim that he invented it from nothing in 1830s Palmyra requires explaining a pattern that the fraud theory was never designed to account for. It's not any kind of proof of revelation, but it is a serious problem for the alternative options. The ancient record doesn't confirm that Joseph Smith was a prophet, but it does confirm that what he described was ancient, and the actual scholarship that would have been required to make it all up didn't even exist yet. So when people describe the LDS view of God as foreign to ancient religious thought, the question worth asking is, which ancient religion did they have in mind? Because it isn't in Sumer, it isn't Egypt, it isn't Canaan, it's not Greece, and it's not the Norse world. It would seem that the LDS picture of heaven seems to have considerably more company in the ancient record than the modern Christian one does. Modern Christianity views God as a single, absolutely simple and immaterial divine substance with no body, no parts, no counsel, no divine family, and no plurality of any kind. Just remember that they view the Trinity as not being plural. But that position is without ancient precedent. It's actually a Greek philosophical development, and it's traceable to specific vocabulary. The centerpiece of the Nicene Creed is the word Homoousios, meaning same substance, and used to describe the relationship between the Father and the Son. But that word does not appear anywhere in Scripture. It was imported from Greek philosophy, not Greek cosmology, and inserted into Christian orthodoxy by council in 325 AD, after decades of theological controversy and disagreement. Gerhard, the German Protestant theologian, documented all of this in his 1978 work, Creatio ex Nihilo, translated into English in 1994, that even the doctrine of creation from nothing was actually a 2nd century philosophical development that was only constructed to counter Gnosticism, not even a reading of the Hebrew text itself. Now, the LDS Church teaches that God has a body of flesh and bone as tangible as man's, and critics try to treat that as self-evidently absurd. But the competing position is a God who is simultaneously three persons and one substance, but definitely not plural, and described by a Greek philosophical term that isn't in the Bible, whose actual defining doctrine was formalized by an emperor who wasn't even baptized until he was on his deathbed in 337 AD, 12 years after Nicaea. Both of those positions require an appeal to faith at some point, but what I'd push back on is the idea that only the LDS Church is obviously unreasonable. Now, in the interest of accuracy, there are some traditions that do teach strict philosophical monotheism, starting with Islam. They believe in one God as absolutely singular, with no partners, no divine counsel, and absolutely no plurality. Then we have Sikhism, with Waheguru as the one formless divine reality and explicitly rejecting divine hierarchy or plurality. And the Baha'i faith. They view God as utterly transcendent and unknowable in his essence, with no associates and no divine plurality. And kind of Zoroastrianism, arguably, for the reasons I already covered. But that's the list: Islam, Sikhism, Baha'i, and maybe Zoroastrianism. And if we remove Zoroastrianism, then the oldest religion that was foundationally monotheistic is Islam in the 7th century AD. So obviously just notice what's not on the list. First, ancient Judaism, which was actually henotheistic in its oldest documented form, with one God supreme and deserving of exclusive loyalty, but without denying the existence of other divine beings. And mainstream Christianity, which teaches that God is simultaneously three persons and one substance, a formulation that doesn't fit the plain definition of monotheism. Theologians call it Trinitarian monotheism, but they have to give it that qualifier to make it work. So when a Christian critic attacks LDS theology for not meeting the monotheistic standard, they're actually invoking a standard that their own tradition doesn't straightforwardly satisfy. Just ask any Muslim. Now, this is kind of the companion argument to what we covered in my video about philosophers that weren't looking for the LDS Church, where I showed that outside thinkers, like philosophers and historians not investigating the Church, kept arriving at theological positions that map onto LDS doctrine. This video that you're watching now shows that the oldest layer of human religious thought wasn't arriving at Nicene theology either. So, the argument moves from two directions simultaneously, and they both point in the same direction. Now, I already know what some of the comments are going to say, so this is a new segment that I'll be adding to all my videos to deal with the most predictable objections now. The first and foremost common objection is, you're just describing paganism. You're admitting that Mormonism is pagan. And that feels a lot sharper than it actually is. But the LDS argument isn't that our theology is Sumerian or Egyptian or Canaanite. It's simply that the cosmological architecture underlying LDS theology isn't a 19th century invention. It's actually the oldest picture of the divine that human civilization has consistently produced, including in the Hebrew Bible itself. Pointing out that Sumer had a divine council doesn't make LDS theology Sumerian, any more than pointing out that Sumer also had flood narratives and therefore makes Genesis Sumerian. And to be clear about the scope we're dealing with, this episode isn't claiming to find the full content of LDS cosmology in the ancient record. The nature of God the Father, the role of Jesus Christ, the plan of salvation, the priesthood, and the temple ordinances are all distinctly their own. What is being claimed is that the underlying cosmological framework of a supreme God, a populated heaven, and divine beings with genuine agency in a structured hierarchy aren't new concepts by any means. They have real ancient precedent everywhere you look. The second objection concerns Heiser specifically. He was a Protestant evangelical. Wouldn't he have rejected the LDS application of his work? Almost certainly. Heiser would not have endorsed LDS theology, and I'm not claiming he would have. But the accuracy of his scholarship is a completely separate question from whether he'd approve of where it leads. When we cite people like Bart Ehrman on textual variants in the New Testament, we're not claiming that Ehrman endorses the LDS Church either. He's agnostic and he has no particular use for any organized religion. But the value of non-LDS scholarship is precisely that it wasn't produced to support LDS conclusions. When the evidence leads somewhere that the scholar didn't intend, that's just a case of the evidence behaving independently of the scholar's personal preferences. And the third, this is a fun one. If God progressed to become God, doesn't that create an infinite regression? God had a God who had a God, and on forever. Well, the short answer is that this objection confuses two words that mean fundamentally different things: infinite and eternal. Infinite means something has a starting point but no end. A laser fired into space, beginning somewhere and extending without terminus. But eternal means no beginning and no end, like a ring, with no point where it starts and no point where it stops. The regress objection assumes the LDS cosmological model is infinite, meaning that there's a starting point somewhere back that we just can't find. But the model is better understood as eternal. God, intelligences, and matter have always existed in one form or another. The question of who made God already assumes a kind of beginning that our framework explicitly rejects. It's a complete category error and not a genuine regress. So let me explain what the church actually teaches. The church doesn't canonize any doctrine of God's prior progression in any specific detail. Point blank. That makes antis mad, and that might make some members mad, but we don't have a specific canonized doctrine for that. What the church does teach is that intelligences are eternal and uncreated, and that God is the supreme intelligence who most fully comprehends and operates in alignment with the eternal laws of existence. All of the mechanics beyond that are genuinely unknown, and the church leaves them that way deliberately, for now. And the fourth objection is, of course, the Bible is the authority. Secular scholarship can't validate theological claims. But now this conflates two separate questions. The argument here isn't that the archaeology validates theology. It's that when the critics claim LDS theology is just a 19th century fabrication with no precedent, archaeology and comparative religious scholarship are exactly the tools that you use to evaluate that specific historical claim. If someone says Joseph Smith invented divine council theology, then the Ugaritic tablets are directly relevant. Not because they prove God exists, but because they demonstrate that the theological framework existed long before Joseph Smith did. Whether Scripture is your ultimate authority is a totally separate conversation from whether the historical claims that critics make about LDS theology are accurate. We're addressing the second one, and on that question, the evidence is not actually on the side of the critics. So given everything that we've established in this video, how does the timeline of modern scholarship bear on whether Joseph Smith simply invented this? Let's go back to my personal story to start this one. When I started doing independent research in the early 2010s, years before I ever seriously engaged with the LDS Church, the Divine Council was the first thread that I pulled at. I was working my way through comparative religion, ancient Near Eastern studies, mythology, and archaeology all on my own, trying to trace religious belief back as far as the record would let me go. I started reading Heiser in 2013 and learning about the Divine Council in the Hebrew text. He was simply doing his scholarship, and what he described, and others that I began to discover, was a cosmological picture that the LDS Church had already articulated in 1830, even if I didn't know it yet. But now that I do, I can find it specifically in 1 Nephi chapter 1 verse 8, where Lehi's inaugural vision places God on his throne surrounded by a heavenly multitude, with the same kind of throne room divine assembly imagery as Isaiah 6 and 1 Kings 22. Moses chapter 4 verses 1 through 4, in the Pearl of Great Price, where a premortal council deliberates over the plan of salvation, with competing proposals from Christ and Lucifer, also with the same deliberative council structure as 1 Kings 22, and Doctrine and Covenants section 121 verse 32, which refers to the council of the eternal God of all other gods, using council language that maps directly onto the Hebrew Adat El. These texts were published in 1830 and 1835, but the Ugaritic tablets that would provide the framework to understand what they were describing weren't discovered until 1929. That's how I found my way to the church, through the scholarship, not through the missionaries. The Divine Council was my door. Now let's take a step back and look at when that scholarship actually became available. Again, the Ugaritic tablets, which established the direct linguistic connection between Bene El and Bene Elohim, and gave the Divine Council framework its philosophical foundation, weren't discovered until 1929, 85 years after Joseph Smith's death. Heiser's systematic treatment of the Divine Council across the entire Hebrew Bible was published in 2015. Margaret Barker's First Temple Theology work developed across the 1980s and the 1990s. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't found until 1947, and the Nag Hammadi texts, Gnostic documents preserving divine hierarchy theology that maps structurally onto aspects of LDS cosmology, weren't discovered until 1945. Joseph Smith was working in 1830s Palmyra, New York, with the King James Bible and the theological world of frontier American Protestantism, overwhelmingly Trinitarian and Reformed, with no concept of divine councils, no access to Ugaritic comparative linguistics, no First Temple theology, and no Dead Sea Scrolls. The critiques leveled at the church for being too strange, too focused on divine plurality, or too committed to bodily divine beings are critiques that had considerably more force in 1830 than they do today, because today we actually know what the ancient world really believed. So the reason that the timeline matters isn't just that it's interesting, but it forecloses the standard critical explanation. The usual alternative to divine revelation is that Joseph Smith absorbed ideas from his cultural environment and synthesized them into something that looked ancient. But that explanation requires those ideas to have been available in his cultural environment to be absorbed. But we've already covered those, so the point is this. You cannot absorb through cultural osmosis what doesn't yet exist in accessible form in your culture. The whole he made it up from his environment theory and the timeline of when the relevant scholarship became available are in direct conflict. That's a direct falsification of the primary alternative explanation, not just a coincidence argument. And we've documented this pattern before, with Nahum, with Chiasmus, and with the creation ex nihilo timeline, just to name a few. The divine council is the same pattern, yet again, applied to the question of who and what God actually is. I also just need to say that the scholars and traditions that I've referenced today are not an exhaustive list, if you didn't get that already. There's actually a much larger body of scholarship that converges on these same conclusions, and a much longer list of ancient traditions that preserve divine council cosmology. My argument today doesn't depend on any single scholar or any single tradition, but the breadth of the convergence itself is part of the point. So to wrap everything up today, I went looking for the oldest belief about God I could find, and that's where I started. I looked across Sumer, Egypt, Canaan, India, Greece, Mesoamerica, the Norse world, and the oldest layers of Hebrew. And what I found consistently was a populated heaven with a presiding God, a council, and divine beings with jobs and agency. But what I could not find at the origin point of any tradition was the God of the Nicene Creed, a single, immaterial, absolutely simple divine substance with no body, no council, and no plurality of any kind. That's not an LDS interpretation of the evidence. It's what Mark Smith at Princeton, Michael Heiser from his years of evangelical scholarship, Frank Moore-Cross at Harvard, Margaret Barker from inside the British Methodist tradition, John Day at Oxford, and a substantial body of other non-LDS researchers concluded after working carefully with the primary sources. The divine plurality that critics frame as the LDS Church's most obvious departure from biblical Christianity turns out to actually be the most ancient layer of the biblical tradition, visible in scriptures like Psalm 82, where God stands in a divine assembly and judges divine beings who will die like men if they fail their mandate, and in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, where the plural deliberation over humanity's creation echoes the same language as the Babylonian Enuma Elish. These aren't proof texts being forced to do the heavy lifting. They're a consistent cosmological framework running across the whole text, and it was denied not by the biblical authors, but by councils that convened centuries later, working from Greek philosophy rather than Hebrew scripture. The strict philosophical monotheism that gets defended as the self-evident ancient biblical baseline is none of those things. It's just a medieval philosophical development enforced through imperial authority, using vocabulary that doesn't ever appear in scripture. The centerpiece of Nicene theology is homoousios, the Greek term meaning same substance, used to define the relationship between the Father and the Son. But search the entire Bible for that word and you won't find it, because it was borrowed from Greek philosophy and inserted into Christian orthodoxy by council in 325. There's nothing wrong with holding that position, but presenting it as the obvious, eternal, biblical view of God while dismissing the LDS position as self-evidently invented or weird now requires you to set aside an absolutely bananas amount of evidence. So here's the thought to take away. You don't have to agree with the LDS Church. You need to work that out for yourself and not based off this video. But there's a very big difference between disagreeing with our conclusions and simply refusing to acknowledge all of the evidence underlying it. The argument that Joseph Smith was an eccentric with weird new ideas about God that had no precedent in the ancient world means that you have to set aside all of Sumer, Egypt, Canaan, Greece, the oldest layers of ancient civilization, a century of comparative ancient Near Eastern scholarship, and all of what the Hebrew text of the Old Testament actually says. That's a caricature. And it's not being intellectually honest on a historical question that deserves the same standard that you'd apply to any other argument. For LDS members watching, the next time someone tells you that the LDS view of God is obviously unbiblical, ask them which layer of the Bible that they're reading. Ask them what Psalm 82 is describing. Ask them what the sons of God in Job 1 are. Ask them why Sumer, Egypt, Greece, India, and the Norse world all independently arrived at the same cosmological structure, and whether the populated heaven or the empty one has more explaining to do. You have the names, the credentials, the texts, and the list now. That's your body of evidence. Use it like one. For skeptics, nothing presented here requires you to accept LDS theology. What it does require, if you're actually engaging honestly, is that you account for this evidence rather than setting it aside. If you accept what Cross and Noth established about the Deuteronomistic editing, and if you accept what Heiser documented about the divine council in the Hebrew text, and if you accept what the comparative record of ancient religion shows, then you've already accepted most of the intellectual foundation that this argument rests on. What you do with that is your own decision. For curious outsiders, the LDS view of God is not that God is one of many equal gods in some ancient mythology sense. We believe that the cosmos is inhabited by divine beings in a relational structure, with God the Father as the supreme being, Jesus Christ as his literal Son and a distinct and separate being, and humanity as his literal children with the capacity to participate in that divine family. And finally, we believe that God communicates according to the capacity, cultural setting, and era of those receiving knowledge, meaning that the historical, symbolic, and cultural differences of these ancient traditions must be understood in context to grasp the deeper intended message. With all of that said, all of the evidence today suggests that this framework may actually be a recovery of what the biblical tradition originally contained, before centuries of philosophical refinement changed the picture and called the result eternal truth. Check out all of my sources below in the pinned comment. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard.